Hey everybody, this is Scott Spratt, fantasy writer for PFF Fantasy. Over the offseason, I developed my rushing and receiving yards added metrics to try to figure out how good players are in real life, because those are the players that are going to get more workload in the future, whether or not they have so far this season. Those metrics look at things like the down, the distance from the end zone, the quality of blocking, air yards on passes, and the defender in coverage to estimate how difficult a pass or rush attempt really is for the running back or receiver. Then it evaluates their success and failure on those plays according to that standard. There have been some really interesting trends so far in yards added this season, and I think they're going to have some fantasy implications. So let's run through them, in particular at running back. I think we should get started with Matt Breida. Breida leads all running backs so far this season in yards added, but what may surprise you is he performed poorly in yards added last season despite a decent-looking 4.4 yards per attempt. The reason for that discrepancy is that Breida had a lot of easy difficulty carries. So many of his carries last season came in situations like on 3rd and longs or when the 49ers were trailing big in games. And in those situations, the defense is more interested in getting the game over with, and they're willing to give up yardage as long as the clock keeps running. Well, interestingly, so far this season, Breida has had some really easy carries again, in particular because of quality run blocking from the 49ers. He has 4.9 yards before contact per attempt, which is more than double the next running back with at least 20-plus carries so far this season. But the reason that Breida has transformed himself from a negative contributor in yards added to a positive contributor is because he's performed really well after contact so far this season. He has 3.5 yards after contact per attempt, which is among the league leaders. But what's really interesting here is that even though teammate Alfred Morris has performed poorly with his yards before contact, in other words, the 49ers aren't giving him very good blocking lanes, he's performed almost as good as Breida after contact with 2.8 yards after contact per attempt. What I think that means is that the yards before contact numbers are going to equalize as the season continues, and I think that this annoying workload split is going to continue between Breida and Alfred Morris over the rest of the season. I think that's going to make it difficult for either player to differentiate himself and become more than a flex option in your running back leagues. Given how well Breida performed recently in Week 2, it might be a good time to consider trading him. Now, apart from Breida, there are 7 other running backs with at least 3 yards after contact per attempt so far this season. 4 of the guys on that list you can probably suspect were there. You've got Ezekiel Elliott, Marshawn Lynch, Isaiah Crowell, and Saquon Barkley, who were all those big, powerful backs you expect to be able to push the pile and break through arm tackles to get those yards after contact. But the other 3 guys on that list are a little bit more surprising, and all 3 of them are top 10 in rushing yards added so far this season. I think they may be good players to look at in fantasy. They are Tevin Coleman, Kenyan Drake, and Phillip Lindsay. Let's go through them one by one. Now, Tevin Coleman is already seeing a good amount of fantasy value because he's filling in for Devontae Freeman while Freeman is injured right now. But what's interesting here is that Coleman is a much smaller player than Freeman, and I think that's the main reason why Freeman's had 3 times as many carries within 5 yards of the end zone over the last 3 seasons. But I think this is really interesting. Coleman has actually scored on a higher percentage of those looks near the goal line than Freeman has in recent seasons, and Coleman actually has a better overall yards after contact per attempt the last 3 years. I think that means that while Freeman is out, Coleman is going to score plenty of touchdowns, which is going to buoy him to be a running back 1 as long as Freeman is out. Meanwhile, when Freeman comes back, I wouldn't be shocked if Coleman continued to get extra work. Coleman has been trending up while Freeman has been trending down in yards added in recent seasons, and from a strategic standpoint, the Falcons actually don't have Coleman under contract beyond this season the way they do Freeman. It may be prudent for the team to rely more heavily on Coleman this season and save Freeman's legs for future years when they may not even have Coleman on the team. Whatever the case, I would definitely be looking at Coleman this season as a quality fantasy option even when Freeman comes back from his injury. All right, next up you have Kenyan Drake. The most interesting thing about his 2017 season was that his 4.8 yards per carry, which is a very impressive number, almost all of which came after contact. Because of that, he was the #1 running back in yards added. So far this season, the Dolphins have been a much better run blocking team, and Drake has continued to perform well after contact. And to me, that makes this Dolphins backfield very similar to what you're seeing in Minnesota with Dalvin Cook and Latavius Murray. Drake is kind of the cook in that equation, and that means even though he's going to be splitting some of those early down carries with Frank Gore, he'll be getting a lot of the passing down work, and that means he's going to be the more valuable fantasy player and could even be a running back 1 with Gore getting a decent amount of touches this season. Don't run away because of this workload split. Invest in Drake. He's going to be great in fantasy this year. Now, the last guy is probably the most interesting because I just didn't see him coming before this season, and I don't think many teams or analysts did either. That's Phillip Lindsay with the Denver Broncos. He actually went undrafted out of Colorado this season, but he has more than 200 yards from scrimmage over the first 2 games. The really discouraging thing here from a fantasy perspective is that the Broncos continue to rely on all 3 of their backs. Devontae Booker hasn't been getting a ton of work, but he's actually been on the field for 20 snaps from scrimmage each of the last 2 games. I think that makes this the dreaded 3 running back partition here, and that's going to make it difficult to rely on any of them in fantasy. The thing I would say is that Lindsay has looked so good from a real-life perspective, you probably want to pick him up because potentially he could get more workload in the future if he continues to perform well. But at least for now, I think Lindsay's biggest fantasy impact is that he's going to be sabotaging Royce Freeman's potential fantasy value for the time being. So keep him on your bench, but pick up Phillip Lindsay because he looks like a really good player. All right, that's going to do it for me this week talking about yards added and the fantasy implications. Definitely check out the other PFF fantasy videos on YouTube. Subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the rest of all of PFF's great content over on the website. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next week.